So we're doing tree ID. So what we are going to go over today, there's a lot to go through, but I'm going to go through it piecemeal. We'll kind of take some breaks and I'll do some interactive poll questions to hopefully keep you guys engaged. So these are the different characteristics we're going to go through when it comes to identifying, oh, Wyatt, you have a very good virtual background that I'm going to hide because it's distracting. So we're going to go through range, habitat, bark, leaves, twigs, flowers, fruits and seeds. The latter ones we'll kind of just be touching on briefly, but really going to focus a lot on leaves. Believe it or not, there's a lot to learn from a leaf. So let's continue on. First thing, like I mentioned, is range. And this might not be something we're super familiar with, but it's basically the area of, for any particular species, it can be wildlife, plants or animals that this applies to, but basically where they're found occurring naturally. And so this example here is one for the loblolly pine. So you can see it's found pretty much in the southeastern United States, all the way out to Texas. So this is just important to keep in mind because say you go and visit somebody out in California and you're like, that's a loblolly pine. Well, guess again, because they don't occur out there. So it's just important to note where particular plant species ranges occur. And certain databases will be a lot more specific. So the Florida Plant Atlas will show you more specifically within the state of Florida where species are found. So it's always good to just start there, kind of the bigger picture. And then focusing in a little bit more is looking at the habitat in which you are standing if you're trying to identify a particular tree. So if you're in, say, a wetland ecosystem like you see here, which the trees featured in this image are cypress trees compared to, on the right, is more of a sandhill habitat. So if you're in a wet environment, pretty much if you see cypress trees growing in your neighborhood that were not planted, you're in a wetter ecosystem or environment. You're very likely not going to be seeing sand pines, which are featured in the image on the right. They cannot tolerate wet areas like a swamp. And vice versa, you're very unlikely to find a cypress growing in a dry sandhill habitat. So again, just kind of stepping back, looking at the bigger picture of where you're occurring. Do you see cypress? Okay, then it's more likely going to be trees that can grow in a wetter environment. Are you seeing trees that typically grow in higher and drier areas like turkey oaks and, like I said, sand pines and things like that? So those are just kind of some quick tips to consider. The common habitats in Florida, you can dive really deep into habitats if you want to get specific. We're not going to do that today. But again, these are just the different ones to consider. So like a flatwoods habitat, for example, they can be wet or dry, but they're typically going to be dominated by pine trees with an understory of either saw palmetto or wiregrass. Hammocks are going to be dominated by oak trees. Understory will vary depending how much light is coming through. If you're in a marsh, we're probably not talking about trees because that's how they're defined, is a wet area that basically lacks trees. So all these to consider. Again, I'm not going to go in depth on them, but there is some tools available. I'll send out some links after that can help you identify what area you're in, what the habitat was considered historically. Okay, so we're going to start off with bark. Why bark? Like, who cares? Whatever, it's just bark. Bark is super important, especially in the wintertime when you don't have leaves to look at. And bark is also something that plants don't necessarily have. So when we're talking trees and plants, there's not a super well-known defined way to say, oh, that's a tree versus a plant. My kind of rule of thumb that I go by is 4 inches at, they call it diameter at breast height, so at 4.5 feet above the ground. If the diameter is 4 inches or greater, we consider that a tree. Regardless, if there's bark present, pay attention to the bark. It's there for many reasons, but it's very helpful for identification. So things you want to take note of are texture, color, and the presence or absence of lenticles, which are pores. It allows for gas exchange. So you can see all the different bark on your screen here. And you know, right off the bat, I could pretty much tell you, I mean, it identifies the trees down at the bottom, but I could do a whole class on identifying trees just based on their bark. So I'm going to take a quick pause again real quick just to hide someone's video so we don't get distracted. Okay. So just take note. Fun thing to do with kiddos is do some leaf rubbings, bark rubbings. We'll get to leaf rubbings later and see, is it rough? Is it smooth? So those are some basics you can start with the kiddos, but bark is very, very important for identification. So another thing to note with bark is it can change over time based on the age of the tree. So bark when a tree is immature will look very different, can look very different from a tree once it is full grown and mature. So you can see this is the same tree. This is a black cherry. We do have some kind of scattered throughout Pinellas County. There's presence of lenticles, which again are for gas exchange, but in a younger tree, you can see it's more of a dark bark with lighter lenticles compared to when they're older, it's the opposite. So take note of as many details as you can when it comes to bark. Okay, so those are kind of some simple ones, range, habitat, bark. Y'all with me? Still good? Because we're going deep with leaves here. Okay, see all this stuff? We're going through all these. So take a deep breath, but you're gonna learn a lot, I promise. So I'm not gonna go through all these right now because we're gonna go through each one individually, and you'll have a whole new appreciation for leaves after this. So first thing you wanna look for is leaf persistence, which is essentially, is it evergreen or deciduous? Evergreen being it's forever green, right? They do not lose their leaves in the fall and winter, whereas deciduous, they do. So image on the left, right, is a pine. Most conifers, keyword most, retain their leaves throughout the year compared to other species that will lose their leaves in the fall and winter. And so there are some species that look very similar, and an easy way to tell it apart if you're trying to identify in the fall or winter is, well, does this one have leaves or not? So next up is leaf structure. So we're just kind of going to be talking about some terminology here that I'll be using as we talk about the other parts of the leaf. So what we would refer to as the leaf is called the leaf blade. And then kind of the leaf stem, if you will, is called the petiole. So that connects the leaf blade to the twig. And then there's also a little structure, sometimes more obvious than others. Some don't even have a stipule, but this is a little vegetative structure that can be found either like right at the base of where the petiole meets the twig, or it can actually be like attached to the petiole itself. So that can be a helpful identifying characteristic for some tree species. So again, I'll kind of be using that terminology throughout, especially when we get into this idea and topic of leaf complexity. So here, we're just talking about two different forms of complexity. A leaf can either be simple, where it branches off and there's just one blade, right? Or compound, where it branches off the twig and then there's multiple leaflets. And there's different forms of a compound leaf structure. So we're going to look closer at that. The thing you want to look for is the bud. So the bud is separate from the leaf stipule, but there's a little bud that will be found at the base of, you guys remember what this is called? The petiole. And so this overall structure, you see how it's not just one leaf blade, there's multiple leaflets. In this case, each individual little I don't want to say leaf because that's not what it is, but these are referred to as leaflets, and this overall thing is referred to as the leaf in a compound leaf structure. So it can look like this as a compound leaf, or it can branch off and then, you know, divide again. So that we call bipinnate. If it just branches off once and then becomes multiple leaflets, that's pinnate. And so you can think of it like this. If this is my petiole and this is just the leaf blade, this would be simple. And then if it breaks and branches off into leaflets, that's when it becomes a compound leaf. And so there's different forms. Sorry, I'm trying to move something off the side of my screen. There's the trifoliate, and then there's also the palmate that looks like your palm, kind of the sample that I was just doing with my hand. So knowing if a leaf is compound or not can drastically narrow down the tree species that you're looking at. So important to know the difference. Now we get into leaf arrangement. So there's 3 different types of leaf arrangement. The main 2 are alternate and opposite, which are pretty straightforward once shown to you and explained. So here you can see this is simple or compound. I'll ask you guys. See the little bud? These are all little buds here. So it branches off and there's just one leaf blade. So this is a simple leaf. And you can see it's alternating up the leaf. So if you were to connect petiole to petiole, you're doing like a little zigzag. And left, right, compared to opposite, where the petioles are directly opposite each other on the twig. So again, the name is very helpful. There's also whorled, which is not very common, but where the leaves will be branching off. So it's essentially like opposite, but there's more than just 2. There will be at least 3 or more leaflets whorled around the twig. So this is just another look at it using real specimens. So you can see alternating along the twig or opposite. This is important to know because, poll question. Oh no, okay, I made this on accident a multiple choice. It's just one correct answer. So just select the one acronym that is used for remembering which trees have opposite leaf arrangement. I don't actually expect you guys to know this, but I thought it'd be fun. And maybe now you'll remember it after this. I didn't even learn this till I was out of college and finished all my forestry classes. So I didn't have this tool to help me. So what is the acronym for remembering which trees have opposite leaf arrangement? I see lots of people changing their answers. All right. A few more votes still coming in. 3, 2, 1. I'll end polling. Share results. So mixed responses again. The majority actually did not get this one correct. The correct answer is mad. And I will highlight that on the next slide. So for remembering, if you see a tree with opposite leaf arrangement, you should be very grateful because that narrows down what species you're looking at quite significantly. So again, there's not really always a catch-all rule with anything in science, but the acronym MAD stands for maple, ash, and dogwood. So there's a variety of different maple species. Most of what we have here is red maple. There's some other species as you get up into North Florida. Ash, we have a few species of ash here. Green ash is probably the most common. And then dogwood, we don't really have the flowering dogwood here, but we do have swamp dogwood. So you can remember MAD if you see opposite, and then go from there. Viburnums, buttonbush, buckeye, which again we don't have in this part of the state, but in North Florida are some others that have opposite leaf arrangement. So again, it's not a catch-all, but can be very helpful for you. So that's why leaf arrangement is important to note. So next thing you want to look at with leaves is leaf shape. So these are just some common leaf shapes that we see on tree species. And so, right, if a tree has needles, that's very helpful. You're not going to see an oak tree with needle-like leaves, just like you're not going to see a pine tree with oblong leaf and leaf shape. So spatulate leaf shape we'll get to later when we talk about a particular species, but some of these are indicative and very, very helpful for narrowing down again what tree species you are looking at. Now, one thing to note, and this really goes for any identification characteristic when you're looking at a tree, is you cannot just look at one leaf or one twig or one area of the bark. You need to assess multiple areas of the tree, especially when it comes to leaves. So what you see on your screen here is all leaves from the same tree. I know, I don't make this stuff up. So these are all from a water oak, but one thing you will notice, so I mentioned that spatulate shaped leaf, which you can really see here. It's much wider at the top of the leaf, and you can see that in all of these. It's wider at the top of the leaf compared to the lower half. So that can be helpful, but again, you want to be looking at multiple leaves, because if you just had this to go by, you might be confused unless you know the other tricks to water oak, which unfortunately we won't get into today. But okay, y'all still with me? There's a lot to leaves. We're like halfway through it. So, all right, here we go. Now, you also have the leaf in your hand, so we're going to just take note of everything that we can. Leaf margins. So when we talk about leaf margins, it's the edge of the leaf. Most leaves have what we call an entire margin. So if it's smooth all the way around, we refer to that as an entire leaf margin. If you flip the leaf over and it looks like a boat, that would be the case with like sand live oak leaves. For those of you that live in a higher and drier area, we call that revolute margins. So they kind of curl under. And then you can see undulate if it's kind of wavy. Serrate is if they have jagged edges. Doubly serrate is instead of it coming off and just being one tooth, there's essentially two. This is an important one. If you have a tree that has double serrate edges, you've already narrowed it down to an elm or a birch, which is huge. In the tree world, if you can narrow down in any way, shape, or form, it's very helpful. Dentate, so think of teeth, so they're very toothed leaf edges. Crenate is kind of like undulate, but much smaller waves. This is the case, we often showcase this leaf with the loblolly bay, for those of you that are familiar with that. Pinnately lobed, so if they have deep lobes throughout the edge of the leaf, and then palmately lobed if they're if it looks like your palm, that is what we call for that. Obviously, mostly referring to maples, but there's also sweet gum that has leaf shapes like that, or leaf margins, I should say. So again, this is an example with the maple, palmately lobed, but more commonly what we're going to see, this is a red bay, and you can see the edges of the leaf are just smooth, and so we call that an entire leaf margin. And breaking it down even further, I kind of hinted at this with the water oak, but if you just look at the top half of the leaf, there's different things that you can note. So there's acuminate, which basically there's like an extra very defined tip to the leaf. Obtuse would be what we're looking for when we refer to the water oak. So it's wider at the tip of the leaf than it is the bottom half. which we'll get to next. So you can just see all the different shapes. If it's just rounded, is it acute? Does it come to kind of a point, but not as extreme as the acuminate tip? So I don't want to go into all these because it can get very overwhelming, but it's just something to note is the shape of the top half of the leaf. And again, so here it is with the water oak. Thank you to James who took this picture for me. But you also want to note the bottom half of the leaf, and there is different things to look for there as well. So it can be obtuse on the bottom half, it can be rounded on the bottom half, heart-shaped, that's always fun. Some people call that cordate for the overall leaf shape when it's shaped like a heart. Truncate if it's just flat. Inequilateral is another really helpful one. James also took another picture for me of that. So if you think about folding your leaf in half, instead of being symmetrical, an inequilateral base is not symmetrical. And you can see that very well defined here. This is an American elm. So you can see the right side does not match the left side. And that's inequilateral base, a very helpful characteristic and one very well known with the elms. Zooming in even further, or just kind of taking a step back and looking at the leaf, is the veins of the leaf. So this can be helpful in identification as well. There's a few different ones highlighted here. So there can be parallel, which is commonly seen with grasses, pinnate, or sometimes I just refer to this as parallel. So you can see the veins are parallel to one another, at least on each side. There's palmate, where they all kind of come from a central point. And then there's arcuate, which it kind of curves up and out towards the edge of the leaf. And we'll showcase some of those here. So this is a key characteristic with dogwoods, both flowering dogwood and swamp dogwood. And you can see that here. Again, thank you, James. The veins come out to the edge of the leaf and then curl up the side. And you can usually see leaf veins from the top or bottom side of the leaf. So whichever way you can see it best. And you guys remember what for veins, leaf venation for this leaf. So this is the American elm. You guys remember the terminology for that? Yes, pinnate. I know you guys all got it correct. Good job. So you can see it's basically, and on the elm, if you follow the vein all the way out, it goes to the point of one of these teeth. This is a doubly serrated edge. You can kind of see it right here. It's 1, 2 teeth, 1, 2 teeth. So just get an elm leaf. There's a lot to learn from them. So next up is leaf surface. This would be one of my favorites to talk about if we were doing an actual hike, but since we're doing it virtually, I'll just tell you about it. So things to note with the leaf surface. So overall texture, is it rough? Is it smooth? Thickness, so the leaf that's featured here is from the southern magnolia, which has a very, very thick leaf. Color is very important to consider both on the top side and underside. And the presence or absence of hairs, or the terminology that we use in the dendrology world, which is the study of forest plants, is pubescence, so the presence or absence of hairs. And you can see on the underside of the southern magnolia leaf, it looks quite different from the top side. This on the left is the top side, is very shiny and smooth. Underside is not shiny, not smooth, and not green. And that's because it's covered in tiny hairs, and tiny rusty colored hairs, which is where it gets the color. So things to note for sure. Sometimes we cannot feel or see the hairs with our eyes. And so I give you this advice with word of caution to know what leaf you were about to do this with. But in my dendrology class, we were told to actually use our tongue to test for the presence or absence of hairs. I'd encourage you to make sure you do this only with species you know that are not poisonous. But it is pretty amazing if you ever get the opportunity, if you have like a live oak or a sand live oak in your yard to try this out, because you can try feeling it with your thumb and then try with your tongue, and you can tell instantly the second your tongue touches the leaf, it's like, oh yes, there's hairs. And so sometimes just the presence or absence of hairs can be distinguishing between one species and another. Don't tell anyone I said that. I'll delete that part of the recording so you can't say it was me. So leaf smell or taste, and again, I'm not going to encourage taste, but I do love using our sense of smell when it comes to identifying, and especially if leaves have a nice aromatic smell to them. So what's featured here is, on the left is sweet gum, and on the right is red maple. The leaves do look pretty similar, especially if you're looking from far away, but if you get a chance to have them in hand, and you can either rub the leaf and it'll give off the oils, or actually crush it in your hands. The sweet gum gives off a very nice smell, and the red maple just smells like a leaf. I don't really know how to describe the odor, but so smell in itself can be a distinguishing characteristic. There's not really any species I could think of to try out with taste. There's black cherry leaves that do have a pretty bitter taste that you could compare with sourwood, but we don't have sourwood here, which obviously the leaves taste sour. So I would just avoid the taste option and just stick with your sense of smell. Again, anytime we're handling or picking up leaves, I should have included this at the beginning, just make sure you at least know what poison ivy looks like. Just be cautious. If you're unsure, just don't touch it. You can always snap a picture and send it to me, and I will help you identify. Okay. Y'all got leaves? There's a lot. I bet you never knew there was so much to a leaf, but it's pretty fun to explore everything. Okay, now we're moving on to twigs, which there's also a lot more to twigs probably than you ever thought. It's not just a stick on the ground. So we're just going to talk briefly about buds, scars, lenticles, the pith, and thorns. We'll go into some of these in more detail than others, but some of these are kind of fun to explore on your own. So when it comes to twigs, old growth cannot necessarily showcase all the features we're going to talk about because it's old. So if you're trying to look at any of these features, try and focus on new growth, which will typically be green when it comes to twigs. So there's different types of buds, which is either where a new leaf is going to emerge or a flower is going to emerge. So there's auxiliary buds, which are on the sides of the twig, and then there's the terminal bud, which is where like the new growth of the twig is going to occur, and that is typically larger and at the very tip of the twig. So when we're looking at buds, or when they're described or defined in a tree or plant identification book, is they can either be scaly, so you can see on the left it kind of looks like scales, or they can be what we refer to as naked, and I don't really know how to describe it, but it looks like this. So basically without the scales, they can look like this. And so there's often in books, it'll describe not only the color of the leaf of the buds, but the size, the shape. And so buds alone can be a helpful identifying characteristic for certain species. All right, we're going to talk about leaf scars next, but first I want to see if you know what they are. So I'm pulling up poll question 3. What is a leaf scar? Is it a scar at the point where a leaf was once attached? A scar on the top side of the leaf? A scar on the bottom side of the leaf? Or a mark you make on a leaf for identification purposes? Okay, I don't see any more votes coming in. Oh, there's one more. I'll give 5 more seconds. All right. You guys are so good. Yes, so the majority of you got it correct. It is a scar at the point where a leaf was once attached. So you might think like, well, who cares? And I'll show you why you should care. So again, this is the point where a leaf was once attached, and this is what it might look like. Again, they will all look different, which is why this is helpful. There's also something else called vascular bundles, which I won't go into depth on, but these can also be helpful. Is basically the source of life to that leaf. The pattern and number of these bundles where the leaf was once attached can be helpful for identification as well. But in terms of leaf scars, what you want to look for is the shape of that leaf scar. So if you're not able to access the leaves up high, or there's no leaves on the tree, and you have a twig that's either eye level or one on the ground, you can look for leaf scars. And so the shapes can be helpful for identification. There's crescent shaped ones, shield shaped, it can be totally circular, heart shaped, which is pretty cool, U-shaped, triangular. So if you have a tree in your yard that you won't do much harm by, just, you can either observe where a leaf once was, or you can actually break it off and see for yourself what the leaf scar shape is. And then again, the lenticels, presence or absence of lenticels is just a helpful thing to note when we're looking at the twigs, because not all tree species have them. So just noting that is important. So one other thing you can do if you have access to a twig is to examine the pith. And the pith is this inner portion of the twig. It's the very center part. You can kind of see the darker line here. So if you cut it into the middle, so cross-sectional lengthwise, there's different types of piths, which if you ever get a chance to see these, it's pretty cool. So most trees have a solid pith where you just cut in and it just looks like it's a darker color, but it's solid. There's two different kind of chambered piths. So there's chambered pith. The one in the middle here it's basically little hollowed sections. It looks really cool if you ever get a chance to see it. On the left is a diaphragmed pith. So you can see sections. It's basically like the solid one, but there's those sections within it. So keys, when you're keying out certain tree species, will say it has a diaphragm pith or a chambered pith. And so if you have access to look at that, it can be helpful. And then just noting presence or absence of thorns. This is similar to the lenticels, but can be helpful in identifying and narrowing down the tree species that you're looking at. Most trees do not have thorns, so if you find one that does, you're going to narrow down your options. Now flowers, I'm not going in depth here. James will probably be talking more about this in his introduction to plant identification that will be happening later this week. And so really just what I want to point out here is to look for and take note of flowers on a tree or lack thereof. Some have very, very showy flowers. Most people think of southern magnolia when they think of a tree that flowers. Others, like our oaks, their flowers are just annoying, right? And they're very small and they're not pretty and they're not showy and they just get all over our cars and yards and driveways. So we're doing a quick throwback here. You guys remember this terminology, trees that have flowers? Let's see. Oops. Are they gymnosperms, fluorosperms, angiosperms, or glossosperms? I see lots of changing of answers, going back and forth. Okay, Majority of you have voted, but for those that are still debating, we'll do like 10 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, there were some last minute changing answers. All right, so with all the changes that happened, the majority of you did get it correct. It is angiosperms. That was just kind of something fun I wanted to throw in for terminology purposes. So there are different types of flowers that can also be helpful for identification, just knowing the different terminology, because when we get into talking about how to use a key, which I'm not going to go in depth, I'm just going to highlight why it's important to know these terms, because they're going to emphasize like flower grows in a spike or a raceme or you know, any of the above. And so if you know the form in which the flower grows, that is important. And then of course, fruits and seeds. Any details that we can collect is helpful because not all of these things are obviously happening at the same time. So just taking note of any fruit and seeds, either that you can see on the tree or directly beneath the tree. So, right, you're not going to see an oak tree putting out what we call winged samaras, which are often associated with maples. And we referred to these, so sweet gum will put out these seed capsules, but also Australian pine puts out a smaller one, which is an invasive tree species. We used to call them ouchies as a kid because they hurt when you walk on them on the beach. And the magnolia fruit. So you can see these all look quite different. And so if you have them in hand, it can help narrow down the tree species that you're looking at. Obviously, if you have acorns, you're going to be looking at some type of oak. We have lots of species of oaks though. So knowing those other characteristics I talked about with leaves and twigs will be helpful there. And then we have our gymnosperms that don't have you know, the beautiful flowers to look at. And so we have things like cones and these berry-like structures that are known and seen on the eastern red cedar. So you can take note, pines grow, the different pine species all have different characteristics of their cones themselves. The red cedar, again, has these distinct berry-like structures. And so if you have these available and in hand, it is helpful. Sorry, there's a bug. All right, y'all feel like masters now? No, you're like, now I have all this information. I have no idea how to identify a tree. So really, the point of all of this is that you need to know these different parts of the tree in order to use what we refer to as a dichotomous key, which is how professionals identify plants in the field. Like I said, I'm not going to go into depth onto how to use them. I believe James will kind of be touching on that in his presentation. So I don't want to tag team on that. But I just want to highlight an example from a field guide that I have. So again, these are called dichotomous keys in in most plant or tree identification books will have these. So it gives you things to look for. So this is a key for if you're looking at what you think might be an oak in the summer. You can see here, it talks about leaf blades, which now you know what that's referring to, is either lobed or very shallowly lobed. The margins are revolute. So remember what that means, they're curved under. It talks about the leaf shape. Is it elliptical, spatulate? The tomentose we didn't get into, but that's basically really, really hairy. So if the pubescence is like extreme, we'd call that tomentose. And so there's all just different terminology that it depends on the type of book. If it's very scientific or not, they'll probably get more technical with the words that they use. But I'm going to share one resource with you that's more beginner tree identification user friendly. And in a resource that I'm going to hand out, which is kind of the foundation for this presentation, there's this really helpful tree identification sheet that allows you to track all these things that I just went over. So you can print this out if you have a tree in your yard and you want to take notes on all these things. You can do that with this very handy dandy sheet. So I'll share that with you guys so you can print it out if you want, or you can create your own. So we started off with range, what feels like a long time ago. Talked about range and habitat and just being aware of those kind of bigger picture things, looking in and focusing in on the bark, because once you start to look at bark, you'll be like, oh my gosh, they are so very different. I walk around my apartment complex and I've been trying to teach myself how to identify just by looking at the bark. Leaves, again, a lot to leaves, so stop and take a look. Same with twigs, flowers and fruits, depending if you have them, to look at. So some resources for you. I'm going to share one more with you that's kind of the more beginner friendly version, but this, if you're a little bit more advanced or want to just dive in, this Native Trees of the Southeast, I call it like my tree Bible. This is my go-to source for tree identification. They have keys throughout the book and is where I got a lot of the information and images from for this presentation. So very helpful tool with lots of information. And then the EDIS publication I mentioned, this is what I'm going to push out that has that link to the sheet that I just showed you. So I'm going to send all those out in an email after. So this is the book that I would recommend. This is through the UF IFAS Extension Bookstore. It's Trees for North and Central Florida. This was put together by one of our state specialists who moved down here from up north and knew all his trees up there, but he's like, this is a whole new world. Again, that range idea, lots of trees that grow in certain parts of the United States are not found elsewhere. So this is a very user-friendly, you can do it by like leaf shape, I think even like colors of flowers, or it's very user-friendly. On the sides of the book, it has different sections, and there's very basic keys for you to figure out like simple compound leaves. So encourage you to check that out if you guys are interested. And with that, how did I do? Y'all are probably toast. Okay. We're going to do quick wrap up poll question. I think it's just honestly one question. And then I'm going to open up the chat box for questions.